Yamamoto's aircraft would go for the major air bases dotted round the island to annihilate America's planes on the ground before they could take off. But this was his prime target, Pearl Harbor, where the pride of America's Pacific Fleet was tightly clustered, utterly unsuspecting what was about to come.
On board the carriers, the pilots put on fresh uniforms and their traditional headbands. They had a ceremonial meal of rice and said their last prayers at the shrines on board. Minutes later, they were off, the crews of the ships lining the deck, waving and cheering.
We listened to the radio. The American stations were broadcasting normally, so it seemed they were not aware of anything. And then I knew that it was going to be a sneak attack.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was scheduled for 8 a.m. Here at Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, the main event on many sailors' minds was the flag-raising ceremony. It was the same every time. At 7:55 a.m., ships' companies gathered, and 5 minutes later, the flags would be raised right across the fleet. On board the USS Nevada, tied up here with the other battleships on Battleship Row, a band was gathering on the deck, preparing to play the national anthem. It was now just moments before 8 a.m. On the USS Nevada, the bandsmen, still halfway through the national anthem, were horrified to see a Japanese plane release a torpedo at a nearby battleship, then peel off, strafing their ship, splintering the deck and shredding the flag. Under fire themselves, the bandsmen finished the national anthem and then dived for cover. Airfields, barracks, and all of America's great battleships came under attack. Just after 8 a.m., a bomb smashed into the USS Arizona, igniting the ammunition store. Down below decks, over 1,000 men lost their lives.
The devastation was just unbelievable on those battleships. You think they're big, heavy, a lot of heavy steel and all that. When you see those superstructures just twisted, big hunks of steel that were twisted just like you take a straw and twist the thing, I couldn't believe the amount of devastation that I saw.
America had lost the best part of its Pacific Fleet. The Japanese had sunk 21 ships, like this one, the Utah. All 8 of the big battleships were out of action. Hundreds of planes had been destroyed, and nearly 2,400 servicemen and civilians had been killed. By attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had made a declaration of war without parallel. The next day, the American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressed the nation.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America was down, but not out. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, a new man was put in charge of what was left of America's Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. He was sent here to Pearl Harbor by the President himself. His orders? Not to return home until Japan was defeated. Nimitz was an experienced commander who'd proved his ability to instill confidence in his men. But he had an enormous task. Morale had plummeted, hundreds of planes had been obliterated, and all the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were out of action. But Nimitz held one ace card. By chance, every one of the aircraft carriers in America's Pacific Fleet had been out of port at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were now all that survived of the main striking force America had in the Pacific. These carriers and their aircraft would now take on the Japanese.
In spring 1942, the Americans began their comeback with a daring raid using their aircraft carriers. On board, a handful of US pilots, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, were taken deep into Japanese waters.
This Doolittle raid involved 16 of these bulky B-25 bombers. They weighed more than 12 tons each. They really weren't designed to take off from aircraft carriers. But for this mission, the bombers were transported on board the USS Hornet within about 700 miles of the Japanese coast. Then at 8 a.m. on April the 18th, carrying as little weight as they could, they moved off along the runway, just managed to take off and headed towards the Japanese capital. For hours, Doolittle and his men flew low over the ocean to avoid the patrolling Japanese planes. Then, when they got to Tokyo, they dropped their bombs. America and her aircraft carriers were beginning to fight back. And just over 2 weeks later, having attacked the Japanese mainland, the US Navy took on the Japanese Navy at sea.
On May the 7th, the American aircraft carriers made their presence felt again when they engaged with Japanese carriers in the Coral Sea, just northeast of Australia. The battle saw the first ever attacks by carrier-based planes on their opponents' carriers, and both sides were hit hard. The Americans managed to sink a small Japanese carrier. But the Japanese destroyed one American carrier and left the other, the USS Yorktown, in flames out at sea.
The Japanese had left the USS Yorktown ablaze in the water. They thought that they'd sunk her, or at the very least crippled her and put her out of action. But what they didn't realize was that there had been a ferocious struggle to save the Yorktown.
With one carrier now destroyed and only a few others operational, every carrier the Americans had left was vital. They had to save the Yorktown. For crews like the Yorktowns, hundreds of miles away from land, knowing how to tackle fire was essential if they were to save their ship. I went to a naval training centre to experience for myself some of the challenges faced by the Yorktown's crew